So good afternoon, everyone. Today we are going to have our recollection to begin our days of personal integration and wellness. And so we begin by getting in touch first with the ever faithful presence of our Lord in our midst, within us, always gazing lovingly upon us. And for a few seconds, I invite you just to dwell on this image of God who gazes upon you lovingly, and God who is pleased with the desire in your heart to spend time with Him, to pray, to be with Him. And so we begin this afternoon's recollection with an opening song.
I long for you, Lenten recollections or reflections like this, I always would like to begin with just kind of a question. No? What do you associate with Lent? Um, what practices, images, feelings do you associate with this season? No? It's not a very light season compared to Advent. No? Abstinence. No? There's sacrifice. There's a lot more in being in touch with suffering. No? And yet, what's interesting about this season of Lent, uh, we are more than a year into this pandemic. And we cannot but take that into consideration what that does to our celebration of this season. There's an article that came out in Commonweal magazine, and this was shared to us by Father Danny Wong. Also gave some recollection points recently, and he shared this article. And what's striking about this is that the author really described this experience as a perpetual Lent. Like, how do we enter into this Lenten season when it feels like we've been in it for a long time? No? So this writer says, how does one enter a time of fasting, of weeping, and rending of hearts when you feel like you've already been in one for so long? No? So this is the author, Claudia Avila Cosnahan. And this just came out some days ago, some weeks ago. No? So how do you enter into this time? Uh, and the readings from Ash Wednesday, it's supposed to kind of usher us into that. But there's something about it that feels strange because we are in some kind of perpetual Lent. No? So how do you ask people to fast? No? How do you ask people to fast when so many people are hungry? How do you ask them to give up comfort, to abstain, when so many people are deprived? Um, or that uh, instruction to pray in secret, like to pray in secret, to don't not pray in public. When so many people are still isolated, they could not go out, they could not go to church because they're older. So, so many people long for connection. No? And um, the ashes remind us of mortality during Ash Wednesday. But do we really need to be reminded of mortality when we are surrounded by so much death, no? And so many people we know have died. Uh, do we need more reminder of our mortality? So um, the author really makes for a very compelling point, no? That we are we are in this season that uh, it invites us to enter into the desert. It invites us to enter into the desert, to return to God with our whole heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. And this year, as we are invited to do that, it is actually an invitation to recognize that we are already there, no? That we are living it. We've been living it this past year. So maybe the question that I pose also in this recollection or in reflection, times of reflection like this, is how can Lent help us make sense of this time of great suffering? You know? How can Lent help us make sense that we are already here, we are living it, we don't have to enter into it? Now, I like this quote from Richard Rohr. No, "The Naked Now" is his book, and he talks about suffering. And um, there are two things that can happen when we are in the midst of suffering. Okay, he said that suffering, of course, can lead you in either of two directions. It can make you very bitter and close you down, or it can make you wise, compassionate, and utterly open. No? I leave that there for a bit and just invite you to kind of consider these words. When you've experienced suffering in your own life, no, how did you experience it inviting you to either closing down or becoming open? In a similar vein, no, Pope Francis also in his book, Let Us Dream, talks about how in the trials of life, you reveal your own heart, how solid it is, how merciful, how big or small. Normal times are like formal social situations. You never have to reveal yourself. No, like pre-pandemic, perhaps we were, or when we are not in a time of crisis or difficulty, we can go about our life. But when you're in a crisis, you have to choose. And in making your choice, you reveal your heart. You know, what do these passages kind of tell us? Like in moments of suffering, in moments of great suffering, um, we can either enter into it fully and open heartedly, or a tendency is also we can close down. uh, And there's something that's quite human about that. Like we, of course, we don't want to be hurt. We don't want to feel pain. We don't want to experience that kind of even just the unease of it. No, um, but there's this writer who's a Buddhist nun that I quote her very much in my talks and things like that because she writes about being fully present in suffering. No? And she tells a story of that when she was younger, she was walking around her neighborhood, and for some reason she was in a bad mood. And then she was angry, and she was kind of uh, muttering to herself, and then she kicked a can in her anger. And then one of her neighbors saw her and yelled out to her, like, "Girl, little girl, don't let life harden your heart." And for some reason, she remembered that many years later, that whenever she'd experienced something that was very, very painful, there was always that kind of dual invitation, like to, I will close down and harden my heart and protect myself, or be invited to open up, you know? And so, going back to that question about how Lent can make sense of this time of great suffering, I would like to offer this time of reflection precisely as this. No? How can this Lenten season be for us a school of compassion? No? Um, that many times when we enter into the season of Lent, even before the pandemic, we enter into it with some kind of like, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's just me, like a firm resolve that this Lent I will give up something, you know? Or this Lent I will endure depriving myself of whatever good thing I like sweets or whatever. Some people go on a media fast. Some go on, they don't drink alcohol or eat chocolate, whatever. Yeah. Um, and it becomes some kind of like a achievement, endurance, athleticism kind of thing. You know, that baga matirang matibay or really nasty. Um, but this year, given that it's a very different Lenten season, no? and this very prolonged sense of Lent, how can we be invited to open up, and really let this season train us, teach us, invite us into becoming more compassionate? So this Lenten season as a school of compassion. You know? um, so one passage that is sometimes read during this season is this, no? From Ezekiel. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. You know? I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. You know? How can that be the grace that we will ask for during this season? How can the grace we ask for is a new heart, a new spirit during this time? Okay. Um, okay. Now, in order to do that, I would like to go through uh, the Lenten practices that we know very well. No? Some of you identified this during the when I asked you about what you associate with Lent. So during the time of Lent, we associate it with practices, Lenten practices. No? Fasting. That's the first thing that comes to your mind when you consider Lent. Fasting, almsgiving, or works of mercy would be the more general term, and prayer. You know? um, so fasting, works of mercy, and prayer. Now, maybe again, we can look at it as things that we do during this season. We do them. I'd like to offer some a little different perspective. Some different way, slightly different way of looking at these practices that actually focus more on how these practices train our hearts to be more compassionate. No? Okay, so let's begin with fasting. Right now, fasting is but there's something about fasting that's trendy. uh, does anyone here do intermittent fasting? No? Can you do a thumbs up if you are doing intermittent fasting? Uh, because some people claim that intermittent fasting is actually healthy and helpful for your body, primarily to lose weight, but they say there's a lot of other health benefits, like it regulates whatever level, blood level, whatever. No, so it's becoming very trendy. And maybe part of you is like, oh, I can do this during Lent, hitting two birds in one stone. You ano ka na, you're fulfilling the season's requirement, plus you get a parang body makeover at the end of it. No? So you may be thinking like that, but maybe um, the common term really the common understanding of fasting is really deprivation. No, parang you deprive yourself of something. You do not consume food. You do not drink. You do not take in. You do not use. And it is related with denying the self. Like whatever the self wants, you say no, you can't have that. It's your sacrifice. So deprivation, self-denial, sacrifice. Those are the things that we associate with fasting. However, an Indian Jesuit shared this with me one time. And then he said that there's a Sanskrit word for fasting, and it's upavasa. No? For those of you who are Cebuano or Bisaya. It's kind of close to the term for fasting, no, which is puasa. Di ba? Pag magpuasa ka, it means that you don't eat. No? So upavasa seems to be very close to that word. Maybe that's where it came from. But the meaning of this Sanskrit word for fasting is really literally staying near. No? Upavasa, you stay near, you remain close to this thing. And there's something that's deeply meaningful about that. No? That upavasa, whatever it is that you're fasting from, really ought to help you stay near, no? To stay near God, for example. And whatever it is that keeps you away from God, you refrain from that. No? And so fasting takes on that deeper meaning of fasting as refraining from anything that keeps us from staying near to God or to our neighbor or to ourselves. No? So fasting as staying near and refraining from anything, no, that prevents us from doing that. Now there are so many things. And when you think about fasting like this, it's not just food. No? It's not just food. Uh, what keeps you far from God, from neighbor, and from self? No? And I say here, first is the illusion of fullness, the illusion that you are full. No? The illusion of fullness, sources of control or distraction, and anything that insulates you. These are the things that that may keep us far from God, from neighbor or ourselves. No, like when we are full, no, of course we're satisfied, and uh, there's there's pleasure in that, of course, no, and we can get attached to that sense of satisfaction. No? And we're always hankering, we're always yearning for that illusion of being satisfied, that something will satisfy me, something will fill my hunger, something will fulfill uh, this need. So that illusion of fullness, and we can be so attached to that that becomes our idol. No, it becomes an idol in itself. It takes the place of God, and it also keeps us far from neighbor because then it really kind of like you prioritize yourself, you know, or it can keep us from our real self, you know, because our fears, uh, because of our fear, our anxiety, we kind of hanker and yearn for these things, and we don't really allow ourselves to get to know who we are. You know? Another thing that keeps us far from God or neighbor is this sources of control or distraction. You know? Uh, like especially during this time of uncertainty, this time of great uncertainty and anxiety. So many people uh, kind of settle for easy certainties. You know? As long as they know something, uh, that's it. And they're more after certainty rather than hope, no? Because hope really um, kind of takes into account the uncertainty. And so during this time, there's a lot of people who are attracted to fundamentalist thinking, no, to very extreme, even right wing conspiracy theories, no, because it's their way of explaining the world, of explaining the pandemic, no, and I'm getting all of these questions about is the Pope part of this whole kind of global conspiracy for COVID to like reboot the whole earth, no, kind of like a world conspiracy. It's like the plot of the Avengers Endgame movie in real life, no, like some people are after eliminating half of the population, things like that, no, the great reset is what they call it. um but for some people it's their way of kind of making sense, and they hold on to that because it's their source of control, no? certainty. Or for some people, they just, because they cannot deal with all the anxiety and the uncertainty, they just numb themselves out and distract themselves. So um, that can keep you away from God, neighbor, or self. Or stuff that insulates you, that keep you safe, and at the same time keep you imprisoned. It insulates you from the pain of the world. I don't have to deal with all of these. No. So then you withdraw. But that ends up also locking you in. Whatever it is that you use to lock things out, like I don't want to feel pain, I don't want to deal with all of those things. You build a wall around yourself, and you also end up locking yourself in, and you are isolated. No, keeps you away from God, from neighbor, and self. And so, the invitation of fasting is really the invitation to vulnerability. Vulnerability, that when you experience hunger, when you experience deprivation, it is an invitation to experience what it's like to be vulnerable. Vulnerable is a word that comes from the Latin for wounding, or wound. So when you're vulnerable, you're open to feel pain. Um, and so vulnerability is really this willingness. you know, Vulnerability is this willingness to show up even in pain, in hunger, fear, sadness, inconvenience. To show up, to be there, to be present, not to run away, not to avoid, and still do what matters. Okay. Um, People who love, people who take care of others, parents, spouses, teachers, frontline healthcare workers know what it's like to be vulnerable in this way, to be able to show up, to be willing to show up, even in the midst of all of these experiences. I remember when the pandemic started and I volunteered in PGH, Philippine General Hospital. I volunteered there for a month just to relieve one of the chaplains, and um, that was early on in the pandemic. That was around April, and that was the first time. It was early when PGH became a COVID facility, and the nurses were dealing with all of that. So you'd have private room nurses suddenly assigned to wards, and they have to retrain, and they only have one set of PPE. So all of that, no, and you can see in their faces the fear, the uncertainty, the anxiety, and yet they were there. They were present. The willingness to show up and to do what matters, and experiencing vulnerability, allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, teaches us to be empathic, to have empathy. What is empathy? Empathy is not parang, oy, kawawa ka naman, no? I have empathy for you. That's not empathy. That may be that may be sympathy, no? But that's not empathy. Empathy is really allowing yourself to enter that person's worldview, to walk in that person's shoes, and to see the world as that person sees it. That's empathy. And when you have that, then you have the capacity to be tender, because you know how difficult things are from their end. So vulnerability is the opposite of building walls. It's the opposite of protecting yourself, no, from pain. Vulnerability is opening yourself up, and only then can you also establish true connection. No? So maybe you'll be moved during this time to pray for this. So how are you invited to show up in your life right now, amidst the pain, the hunger, the fear, the uncertainty? And how does showing up help you grow in empathy? Okay. So I will stay here for a bit and allow those points to just kind of sink in. Um, so the next is, so aside from fasting, Lent is also the time when we do works of mercy, no? Um, and the classic works of mercy, of course, are, the corporal works of mercy: feed the hungry, shelter the homeless, clothe the naked, visit the sick, bury the dead, give alms to the poor. No, instruct, and then those are the corporal works of mercy. And then the spiritual works of mercy: to instruct, advise, console, comfort, forgive. Uh, bear wrongs patiently. Okay. So, and perhaps we are doing these things already, even outside of Lent, and we are engaged in whatever works of mercy that we are doing. But as we look at these practices, and whenever we engage in them, uh, the question in my mind is something like this. No? Like when we engage in works of mercy, there seems to be a gap between the giver, the one who gives, who does the work of mercy, and the one who receives. No, and how there's a one who's the one who's giving, no, and the one receiving, and there's a difference because you're a giver. There's something that you can give that the receiver doesn't have, and so you're in a position that's kind of uh, you know um, different and above in a way. Um, but I don't know if you remember, this came out some years back, and during the Jubilee Year of Mercy, this was something that became very meaningful, at least to me personally. This idea of mercy really as the willingness to enter into the chaos of another. That mercy is the willingness to enter into the chaos of another. And if you look at mercy in this way, as the willingness to enter into the chaos of another, how does that change our idea of the works of mercy? That it's not just, okay, I am here in a position to give and I'm giving to you because you have nothing. And that's fine. That's the extent of my giving. Um, and you walk away from that activity feeling grateful that you're able to give, and then you go back to your own life. And, but mercy, seen this way, is really the willingness to enter into the chaos of another. That you are willing to enter into the pain of this person. That you are not just giving something and then not be affected by it, but fully entering into that reality. No? Um, and gestures of mercy, um, I've arranged. There's a range from the great gestures of mercy to very small, undetected, not obvious works of mercy. And quite recently, I was just listening. I like listening to podcasts, and one of the podcasts I listened to was this interview of this Jewish writer Ariel Berker, and he tells this story of like in the concentration camps, the Nazi concentration camps. In one of those concentration camps, there was a rabbit farmer, a rabbit farmer who took care of rabbits. So he was Polish, he was not Jewish. So he was allowed to live, take care of the rabbits because the rabbits were used for experiments by the Nazis. And so they were experimenting, researching for cure for some particular disease. They were using rabbits. So this rabbit farmer was very highly valued by the Nazis in that camp because he took care of the rabbits, so the rabbits were well fed, things like that. And also in that camp were Jewish prisoners who were working there. And the farmer, noted that the rabbits were better nourished, better fed than um, the prisoners, of course. And there was always something about it that bothered him. But one day there was a woman who was wounded, a Jewish prisoner, a female Jew, was wounded with a barbed wire in the fence, and her wound was becoming infected. And the farmer really took pity on this woman. And the infection got worse. And of course, being a Jewish prisoner, there was no way that she would be able to get antibiotics to cure her wound. You know? And the farmer, in order to help her, what the farmer did was to cut himself. He cut himself, he wounded himself, he rubbed his wound on the woman's wound so that it will also get the infection that she had. And then he allowed the infection to fester. And then he went to the Nazi officers and said, "Look, I am getting infected. I need antibiotics. If you don't give me antibiotics, I will die, and then no one will take care of the rabbits." So he got his antibiotics, and he also got for the woman, no? And so he administered to the woman. And the storyteller, Ariel Berger, told this story because he got this story from the grandson of the woman. So the grandson of the woman who's alive now uh, went to Poland, looked for the farmer who was still alive to thank him for his life. You know? That this Polish farmer who could have just allowed her to die, took pity, and not only took pity, but really entered into her pain, her infection. You know? So I think that captures very much what this gesture of mercy is. Granted, it's such like a grand, may seem like a grand gesture, a great gesture, but it captures it very well. That when we provide mercy, it sometimes it takes that we are wounded in the process. You know? um, Another example of this is from this poet, who's also a Jewish Holocaust survivor, Edith Brooke. And Edith Brooke was visited by the Pope recently. And she writes, "It takes only a few gestures to save the world." And she was interviewed recently, and the Pope, reading her recent interview, was so moved that he visited her. And he visited her, and um, she was. They were both moved. They were just crying during that visit, and she was telling her story. And she survived that whole ordeal. And people were telling her, people who died there, telling her, tell the story, because if you survive, you'll be telling the story for us too. And one of the stories that she tells is really um, how, when she was a young girl and in one of those concentration camps, uh, really was, um, she met a chef, a German cook. And the German cook, looking at her and looking at her appearance, malnourished, disheveled, and was just moved looking at her. And then that cook gave her a comb, suklay, to comb her hair with. And then the cook was so visibly moved in tears. And then the cook just told her, "I have a daughter also. I have a daughter." And then Edith Brooke said that gesture, that very simple gesture of giving her a comb just to comb her hair, made her feel like a person again. That there were persons around, and that she made it made her feel like a person again. So again, a very simple, quiet gesture, but deeply felt. No? And so, when we do works of mercy during this time, and in all the times of the year, how are these really calls and invitations for solidarity? Not just because we are in a position that we can give, no? But that we can be with them. And it doesn't have to be a grand gesture. You don't have to empty your bank account to be able to do that. It's just to make them feel like they're people, that they're persons, that they're not just, that you're encountering them as people. Um, and that is the invitation to solidarity. Um, Another way to express this in language is solidarity as kingship, kinship. We are all created by God. We share in the gift of life and being granted by one Father. So we are kin. uh, And this quote from Greg Boyle, there is no us and them, only us. No? Now, I don't know if you know Greg Boyle. Greg Boyle is a Jesuit who works in Los Angeles, and his work is really with gangs in LA. And you know, the gangs in LA are notorious for being violent, and there's so many gang wars. And so this Jesuit lived with the gangs and slowly established livelihood programs. So there's a bakery, there's a printing shop, there's all sorts of livelihood programs so that he can give um, an option to these gang members. And one of his key insights in his ministry is that uh, they are um, kind of um, they're rival gangs in the same livelihood program. And outside their compound, they might be killing each other. But because they found their way into that ministry, homeboy industries, then they're able to find some form of kinship, even if they belong to rival gangs. The slogan of this ministry is nothing stops a bullet like a job. No? That they are giving these gang members an alternative way of life with work, with dignity. Um, and in that they find some kind of kinship. And another form of kinship that they experience that when Greg Boyle brings some of these gang members to conferences or to donors, prospective benefactors, he'd bring all of these like big guys with tattoos and piercings, and they look very menacing. But when they get in front and tell their story, the listeners are just so moved, and then they realize there's no difference between them and us. You know? Now, of course, I know very well that this can sound very ideal, no? And especially in this very fragmented political sphere, uh, that we can look at people who don't share our political views as less than human. No? And solidarity extends to them. So mahirap. But again, what is the call? No? But even within our own boundaries, even within our spheres of influence, how are we called to this level of solidarity, no? Of kinship? And so, looking at works of mercy, how are we invited to this? Maybe what we can reflect on, first of all, is who were those who showed willingness to enter into our chaos? No? Do you have that experience in your life? That somebody took the time, made the effort to listen to you, to ask you how you were, to make you feel like you're a person. What did they impart? What gestures did they do? Were they grand gestures? Were they quiet gestures? And what can you learn from them? No? Um, and then what gestures of mercy are you invited to embody those around you? The last Lenten practice that I want to talk about is really prayer. No? And I will not say a lot of things about this, except to first begin with one of the, I think, most moving passages during this time, read around this time, or it's in keeping with the season. Now, this is Jesus' experience praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he shares with his disciples. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." But somehow he was pleading to his friends that part of their uh, what they do that night would be to stay with him as he is praying, to stay. Um, and this echoes an earlier time, and this is from a different gospel. In the Gospel of John, so when the first disciples saw Jesus, they asked him, "Where are you staying?" And then he says, "Come and see." And so they went and saw where he was staying, and they spent that day with him, no? Staying with him and spent that day with him. And there's not a lot that's said about what they did when they stayed with him. No? And what does that mean to stay with him? So we do not know what they did, no? But maybe that's the point. Uh, Maybe that's the point of the whole staying with him. No? That it's not so much of what you do. Um, it's really just being there. And Jesus is not simply someone we work for. No, he is our friend, and he is friend to us. So, and with friends, um, it's not always a case that we do something. And the best kind of times with friends, like when we don't have to do anything, and we can be together. It doesn't have to be something significant. No. And maybe that is the point about prayer that I'd like to make, because prayer is really an invitation to companionship. That in prayer, more than us saying things and asking God and begging God, of course we can do that. But prayer, first of all, is this revealing of God's heart to us in vulnerability and solidarity. No? Um, and we see this classic image of the Lord, with the Sacred Heart, and this heart that He's showing to us is a heart that is pierced, a heart that is wounded and bleeding, a heart that is surrounded by thorns, and yet it is still a heart that's on fire. And so, in prayer, God reveals His heart to us first of all, in vulnerability and solidarity. And so the invitation to vulnerability and solidarity isn't just because this is something that we can do, but it's really because God has done this first to us. And nothing uh, makes us experience that quite like Lent, quite like the season of Lent and the Paschal Triduum. We really see the Lord's heart, God's heart, revealed to us in such a fashion. Um, and because that's what compassion really is. And if we are going to be schooled in this art of compassion, or having compassionate hearts, we're really learning from the Master, literally, no? That He is the source of our compassion. We can truly be compassionate, not on our own merit, but from learning from Him, and how He was. But the way compassion is understood, again, is not something that He's above us and we're below. Um, and here another quote that shared to us from that Buddhist writer, Pema Chodron. She says that compassion is really not a relationship between the healer and the wounded. No, it's a relationship between equals. Only when we know our own darkness well can we be present with the darkness of others. Compassion becomes real when we recognize our shared humanity. And this may be written by a Buddhist nun, but when I read this, I said, that's exactly what our God did. That's exactly what the Lord did. That He did not have compassion on us from above, because that's not compassion. The way the way God showed us compassion is by sharing in our humanity, by sharing in our darkness. And by sharing in our darkness, that's how we come to light. No? And so as we pray during this Lenten season, how can we really let this prayer be an invitation to companionship? No? Not a lot of activity and doing, but just being with, and to be schooled in this compassion by learning from the source of all compassion. No? Maybe something that might help us kind of reflect also on that is, how are you experiencing God accompanying you at this time? You know, how is He showing His heart to you at this time, great suffering? And how do you sense the Lord's invitation to stay?
Turuan mo akong maging bukas palad. Turuan mo akong maglingkod sa iyo, na magbigay ng ayon sa nararapat, na walang hinihintay mula sa'yo, na mag-iba kang di inaalintanan, mga hirap na dinaranas sa tuwing ay magsumikap na hindi humahanap ng kapalit na kaginhawaan, na di naghihintay kundi ang aking mabati, na ang loob mo siyang sinusundan. Turuan mo akong maging bukas palad. Turuan mo akong maglingkod sa iyo, na magbigay ng ayon sa nararapat, na walang hinihintay mula sa'yo.
So that ends our recollection to start the beginning of our days of personal integration and wellness. So from today up to the 27th, we are now we will now be able to access our Google Site link. The recording of the orientation yesterday will be shown in that Google Site. It is a website basically called Making Space, and also the recording of this video will be found there. And we will be, for those of you who were not able to join us for the introduction to the days of wellness, that means you will have to view the introduction video on the Google site. Okay, everyone? So we will, the prayer points that Father Orbe has given, we will post that in March 6, 2021. On the prayer guide, you just click the date March 6. That is where we will post the reflection points of the recollection of Father Jordan Orbe. So may God be with you, and remember that when we desire to pray, or at the very least, we desire to pray, God's generosity to us will never be outdone. Thank you, everyone. See you once again.